In the early 1990s, China and India stood on similar ground. Both were home to over a billion people. Both had per capita GDPs hovering around a few $100s. Both were just beginning to step out of decades of economic insulation. At that moment, the global economy offered a promise. Open your markets, integrate into global trade, and prosperity will follow. China took the deal. With precision and pragmatism, it turned itself into the factory of the world. Low wages, strong infrastructure, and a government willing to do whatever it took to attract foreign capital helped it grow at breakneck speed. Exports became its engine. Global companies lined up to make their products in Shenzhen and Guangzhou. And by the time the 2000s arrived, China's growth had already begun to pull it far ahead of India. India opened up too, but more cautiously. Reforms came not by grand vision, but by crisis. In 1991, a balance of payments emergency forced the Indian government to liberalize. Tariffs were slashed, controls dismantled, and for the first time in decades, foreign investment flowed in. India didn't become a manufacturing powerhouse like China, but it found a niche in services, IT, outsourcing, pharmaceuticals. Its middle class began to grow. Its economy began to hum. Trade worked. Not perfectly, not equally, but undeniably, it created opportunity. It helped lift millions out of poverty in both nations. It integrated them into a global system built on the promise of shared growth. China and India became case studies of what globalization could achieve, but now, 3 decades later, that promise is under pressure. The rules of trade are shifting. Protectionism is back. Supply chains are moving, not just for efficiency, but for security. Countries that once championed open markets are rethinking their dependencies. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls, these aren't exceptions anymore. They're becoming the norm. Today, as China is viewed increasingly through a lens of rivalry and India is courted as a counterweight, we are watching the map of global trade being redrawn, not by markets, but by politics. The era of globalization is giving way to something else. Fragmentation, realignment, perhaps even division. This is where we begin. This episode explores how we got here, what's at stake, and what this new global order could look like. Welcome as you're listening to Thread by Thread, a podcast where each episode unravels a new thread, connecting stories of power, people, and the forces shaping our world. I'm Dheeraj Kumar. For over 2 centuries, economists have tried to explain how and why nations trade, and these theories evolved as the world changed. Classical trade theory began with Adam Smith's idea of absolute advantage. Countries should specialize in producing what they make most efficiently and trade for the rest so everyone is better off. David Ricardo took it further with comparative advantage, showing that even if one country is better at everything, it still gains by focusing on goods it's relatively best at. This classical view underpinned the post-WO push for free trade, promising that open markets would raise living standards globally. In the early 20th century, the Heckscher-Ohlin model added nuance by including multiple factors of production, chiefly labor and capital. It assumed countries differ in their factor endowments. For example, some have abundant labor, others abundant capital or land. The model predicts that each country will export products that use its plentiful factor intensively and import products that use its scarce factor. For instance, a labor-rich country would export labor-intensive goods, while a capital-rich country exports capital-intensive goods. The outcome of trade in this model is still a net gain globally, but with a caveat: not everyone within a country wins. As trade opens, the abundant factor tends to gain, its income rises, and the scarce factor loses out, a result known as the Stolper-Samuelson effect. In other words, free trade could lower wages for workers in a capital-rich country or hurt capital owners in a labor-rich country. Heckscher-Ohlin thus offered an early explanation for unequal benefits. It suggested why, for example, unskilled workers in wealthy countries might feel squeezed when faced with imports from labor-abundant nations. Overall, though, the model still assumed a world of perfect competition and constant returns, where trade would equalize factor prices, wages, returns on capital between countries over time. By the late 20th century, reality was outpacing these classical models. Fast forward to the 21st century, and we see the rise of the global value chain (GVC) paradigm. This isn't a single formal theory by one economist, but rather a framework to understand how globalization actually operates today. The classical image of trade, say England sells cloth and Portugal sells wine, has been overtaken by complex supply chains. Now, a product like a smartphone or a car isn't made in one country. Its parts are made all over the world and assembled in another location. Global value chain analysis builds on earlier theories. It still relies on comparative advantage for why each piece is made where it is most efficient. But it recognizes that intermediate goods and tasks are being traded, not just final products. Several factors enable this fragmentation: technological advances, container shipping, the IT revolution, and decades of trade liberalization. Countries like China benefited enormously by becoming the preferred assembly hub for global companies. However, GVCs also highlighted that while efficiency soared, the gains might be unevenly split along the chain. High-tech components and design reap more profit than assembly labor. This brings us to modern concerns about who really benefits from trade. Finally, the global value chain's perspective is perhaps most relevant of all in the modern context. China's export led growth was hugely enabled by GVCs. Global companies brought capital and know how, and China supplied efficient labor and infrastructure to assemble products that were then shipped worldwide. Instead of having to invent and produce a whole computer, China could join an existing production network led by, say, American and Taiwanese firms. Over time, Chinese firms themselves moved up to design more components. India also engaged with GVCs. For example, in the automotive sector, global car makers source a lot of parts from Indian suppliers now, and Indian IT companies became key nodes in the supply chains for global corporate services. The GVC idea also highlights why India didn't industrialize as broadly as China. Global manufacturing chains in the late 20th century were very focused on East Asia. China, plus neighbors like Malaysia, Thailand, and later Vietnam, became deeply integrated into electronics and machinery chains. India was less involved there, which some argue slowed its manufacturing takeoff. Today, however, both countries see GVC integration as crucial. India is courting companies to relocate supply chains from China into India, essentially trying to insert itself into the networks that made China rich. Meanwhile, China is moving to capture more value domestically. Instead of just assembling iPhones for Apple, Chinese firms now produce many components and are developing their own branded products. GVC theory doesn't contradict earlier theories. It layers on top an understanding that how trade is structured matters. It explains modern realities like why trade disputes often focus on specific inputs, chips, batteries, rare minerals, because these are critical nodes in value chains. It also provides a framework for why the benefits of trade might appear unequal. A country that only does low value assembly might feel it's not gaining as much as the country doing high tech design, even if both are trading intensely. This is a key insight for debates today on fair trade and development. Despite the insights these theories provide, none perfectly foresaw all the complexities of today's global economy. Trade has brought clear benefits. For example, it's hard to imagine China lifting 800 million people out of poverty without the export boom. But it's also created stark disparities and vulnerabilities. Unequal trade benefits are now at the forefront of political debate. Classical theory optimistically said everyone wins in the long run, but it didn't dwell on short-run pain or distribution. The reality is that while consumers everywhere got cheaper goods, certain communities, like factory towns in the American Midwest or textile hubs in Mexico, were devastated when production moved overseas. Heckscher Olin at least anticipated that kind of redistribution. Though real life is messier, governments don't always compensate the losers as the theory might imply they should. New trade theory and GVCs add that the structure of global industries can concentrate gains. Think of the profits Apple earns versus the wages of the workers assembling iPhones in Shenzhen or Chennai. The value chain concept helps explain why the gains from that internationally made product are skewed. So while traditional theory said trade is win-win, modern analysis acknowledges it's win-win in aggregate, but with plenty of losers mixed in. especially when adjustment policies fail. This gap between theory and lived experience has fueled a backlash against free trade in many countries. Entire supply chains uprooted and relocated because companies found they could save pennies on the dollar by assembling iPads in Chengdu instead of California. New trade theory would say once China became the hub for electronics, it achieved a self sustaining advantage, which indeed we saw. Even as wages rose, much manufacturing stayed put in China because of its unparalleled network of suppliers and know how. Now we are seeing the next shift. As China's costs have risen and geopolitical risks grow, some manufacturing is moving again to places like Vietnam, India, or back to the West. Comparative advantage still plays a role. Vietnam has very cheap labor. The US has abundant capital and skilled engineers for advanced manufacturing, but political factors are stronger than before. The concept of comparative advantage struggles when governments intervene heavily, e.g., through tariffs or subsidies to reshore industry. Nonetheless, the fundamental idea that production finds the most cost effective location remains a force. It's just now balanced against new concerns about resilience and security. This brings us to deglobalization, or at least what's been dubbed slowbalization. The noticeable slowdown in trade growth and increasing talk of economic decoupling in recent years. None of the classic theories anticipated a voluntary pulling back from global integration. They mostly assumed more trade is always good economically. Yet, since about 2008, world trade as a share of GDP has plateaued and even dipped in some years. The 2008 financial crisis, a populist turn in politics, and geopolitical rivalries have all curbed the fervor for free trade. We see tariffs being reintroduced, supply chains being shortened, and multinational companies questioning if far flung production is worth the risk. The trade theories we reviewed don't predict this retreat, but they help explain its consequences. For instance, if we throw up barriers, Ricardo's logic tells us we lose some efficiency. Consumers face higher prices and less choice. Heckscher Olin would warn that reversing trade could, in theory, raise real incomes for some previously hurt groups, say certain factory workers, but at a larger cost to overall welfare. New trade theory suggests that breaking global scale into smaller regional scales will raise production costs, since firms can't produce at the massive volumes they used to globally, and reduce variety. And GVC analysis clearly shows that unwinding interdependence is complicated. After decades of optimizing supply chains, trying to duplicate or regionalize them means significant adjustment costs. In sum, the trend toward deglobalization is a political response to the uneven outcomes of prior globalization. But economics theory reminds us that turning back the clock on trade generally comes at a price. Understanding where the theories fall short is as important as knowing what they explain, especially as we transition to the next part of our discussion: the geopolitical forces currently reshaping trade, akin to a new iron curtain descending on the global economy. The world economy today is being buffeted by geopolitical gales, erecting new barriers in global trade that some liken to a new iron curtain. Decades of growing interdependence are now giving way to distrust and fragmentation, most visibly between the United States and China. This US China decoupling began in earnest a few years ago and has accelerated. After roughly 40 years of deep integration, in which supply chains freely spanned from Michigan to Guangzhou, and bilateral trade ballooned to nearly $700 billion annually, the relationship has turned tense. In 2018, the United States launched a trade war, slapping tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports, aiming to protect industries and push China to change trade practices. China retaliated with its own tariffs on US goods. Those tariffs marked the first bricks in a new wall. By making Chinese products pricier, they spurred some companies to shift sourcing to other countries. Fast forward to today, and we see that nearly two-thirds of Chinese goods sold in the US still face import taxes. While the initial rhetoric was about fair trade and jobs, the focus has increasingly shifted to national security, especially in high tech sectors. Washington and Beijing now view each other as strategic rivals, and this rivalry is playing out through restrictions on trade and investment, particularly for technologies deemed critical. The most dramatic front in this economic conflict has been dubbed the semiconductor chip war. Semiconductors are the tiny brains powering everything from smartphones to fighter jets, and the US wants to maintain a lead while preventing its rival from acquiring cutting edge chips. In October 2022, the Biden administration took unprecedented steps to curb China's access to advanced semiconductors. New export controls banned the sale to China of the most advanced chips and, importantly, the equipment used to manufacture those chips. American engineers were barred from assisting Chinese fabs producing high end chips, and companies worldwide that use any American tech in chip making had to heed these rules. Essentially, the US sought to freeze China out of the top tier of chip technology. These measures hit China's tech industry hard. Semiconductors are a foundation for artificial intelligence, military systems, and modern electronics, and China still relies heavily on imported know how for the cutting edge. Of course, China has not stood still. It poured billions into its own chip research and started campaigns to boost self reliance, but catching up in this industry is extremely challenging and time consuming. By weaponizing tech exports, the US signaled that globalization has limits. Certain know how will not be freely traded if it might empower a strategic adversary. China, for its part, has used its leverage in other areas of the supply chain as a form of pushback. A striking example came in 2023 when Beijing announced tight export restrictions on rare minerals crucial for making semiconductors and other high tech products. Two obscure sounding elements, gallium and germanium, suddenly made headlines. These minerals are used in semiconductor chips, aerospace components, and telecommunications equipment, and China happens to dominate their global supply, producing an estimated 80 to 90% of the world's output. By requiring special licenses and effectively cutting off exports of these materials, China sent a message. If the US can choke off advanced chips to China, China can choke off the feedstock for some of the West's tech manufacturing. Later, in 2024, China even broadened these curbs into an all out ban to the US on gallium, germanium, and certain other mineral exports, citing national security. The immediate impact on industries was limited. Companies had stockpiles and other sources for the short term, but the strategic signal was clear. This tit for tat dynamic is reminiscent of a Cold War style standoff, except instead of nuclear arms, we are talking about silicon wafers and rare earths. Each side is identifying choke points. The US controls the high end chip designs and manufacturing tools, while China controls many raw materials and an enormous consumer market. Businesses caught in the middle must navigate an environment where selling to one side might mean being cut off from the other. Beyond these high tech battles, a broader rethink of supply chains is underway. Reshoring and friendshoring have become buzzwords in boardrooms and government offices alike. Reshoring means bringing production back to one's own country, and friendshoring means relocating it to allied or friendly nations deemed geopolitically safe. The United States and European countries, after experiencing supply disruptions like medical gear shortages in the pandemic and witnessing geopolitical risks like Russia's war in Ukraine or tensions over Taiwan, have adopted policies to incentivize more local and allied production. A marquee example is the CHIPS and Science Act that President Biden signed into law in August 2022. This legislation provides roughly $52 billion in subsidies and incentives to build semiconductor factories on US soil. The goal is to reduce reliance on Asia's semiconductor hubs, Taiwan, South Korea, China, and to secure the supply of the brains of modern technology. The impact has been immediate. Tech giants and manufacturers have announced new projects across the United States. Taiwan's TSMC, the world's leading chip manufacturer, is investing a whopping $40 billion to set up two cutting-edge chip fabs in Arizona, slated to start production in 2024 and 2026. Similarly, Intel is expanding its chip plants in Ohio and Arizona, and Samsung is building a large facility in Texas. These are long term investments. It takes years to build and equip a semiconductor fab, but they mark a significant shift toward onshore production of a critical component. It's a stark reversal of the earlier trend where manufacturing relentlessly flowed to the lowest cost location. Now, considerations like does this factory lie in a country we trust are as important as labor or materials cost. Friends shoring extends this idea internationally rather than spread supply chains wherever costs are lowest. Companies are now directed, implicitly or explicitly, to favor countries with shared values or alliances. US officials have encouraged moving factories from China to places like Mexico, Vietnam, India, or Eastern Europe, places that are either politically aligned or at least not viewed as adversaries. We see this clearly in the electronics and consumer goods industries. Apple Inc., for instance, spent decades building a massive production ecosystem in China, which became the source of the majority of iPhones and iPads worldwide. But in the past couple of years, Apple has accelerated plans to diversify that supply chain. It started producing recent iPhone models in India. In fact, by 2026, Apple aims to produce the bulk of iPhones destined for the US market within India. This is a remarkable pivot for a company so entwined with China's manufacturing prowess. The company has also expanded production of AirPods and Apple Watches to Vietnam. These moves are partly to hedge against political risk, trade wars, Chinese regulations, even hypotheticals like conflict over Taiwan, and partly due to rising Chinese labor costs. Apple isn't alone. Other electronics firms and apparel makers are making similar shifts. Vietnam has been a big winner, drawing investment for everything from smartphones to solar panels. India, with its huge workforce and large market, is positioning itself as the next big manufacturing base, though it still needs to overcome infrastructure and policy hurdles to truly rival China. The assumption now is that a more distributed, politically cautious supply chain is inherently more resilient. Companies learned a lesson when COVID-19 shut factories and when geopolitical tensions spiked. Being too concentrated in one country, especially if it's an authoritarian rival, is a vulnerability. Europe is also practicing friendshoring. The EU has initiatives for strategic autonomy, meaning they want key products, whether medical supplies, batteries, or chips, made either in Europe or in friendly nations, not left to a distant, potentially hostile supplier. Japan likewise has paid its companies to relocate factories out of China back to Japan or to Southeast Asia. Even China, notably, is doubling down on a concept it calls dual circulation, essentially becoming more self-sufficient in critical areas while still exporting to the world. So in a way, friendshoring is contagious. Each bloc of countries is trying to shore up its own network of trusted trade partners. While these shifts are understandable, they come with real-world impacts that aren't all positive. For one, reconfiguring supply chains is costly. Building new factories or expanding old ones in different locations means huge capital expenditure. It often also means higher operating costs. For example, manufacturing microchips in the US or Europe is simply more expensive than in Taiwan or China due to higher labor and construction costs. Who will ultimately pay for that? Likely consumers via higher prices, and taxpayers via subsidies given to companies. We might not see the full effect immediately. Many companies will try to absorb costs or automate more, but over time, a less efficient allocation of production tends to inch prices up. In the case of semiconductors, the CHIPS Act subsidies are meant to offset the cost difference and attract firms to build in the US. Still, industry analysts note that American-made chips could be pricier, and someone has to foot that bill. Another consequence is the risk of duplication and lost scale. If the world splits into, say, a Western supply chain and a China-centered supply chain, we won't enjoy the same economies of scale as a single global chain. This could slow down innovation and make it harder to respond to surges in demand. The recent global chip shortage in 2021 to 2022 illustrated how tight and interdependent the system is. A drought in Taiwan or a fire at a Japanese chip plant can stall car factories in Detroit. Breaking that interdependence might prevent one country's problem from cascading, but it also means each bloc has less flexibility and buffer because resources aren't pooled globally. Crucially, the global poor stand to lose the most if this trend continues. In the last few decades, one of the engines of poverty reduction in developing countries was access to global markets and investment. China is the poster child, but countries from Bangladesh with textiles to Ethiopia with light manufacturing benefited from an open trading system where they could specialize and export. If rich countries now pull back, insisting on making more at home or only buying from a narrow list of allies, many low income nations could be left out in the cold. For example, a country like Bangladesh relies on selling apparel to the US and Europe. Higher tariffs or a focus on sourcing from, say, Mexico or India instead could hit Bangladeshi factories and workers. Similarly, African countries hoping to attract manufacturing as China moves upscale might find fewer opportunities if companies simply reshore to Western sites or stick to politically aligned locales. There's also the impact on consumers worldwide. If protectionism drives up the cost of goods, it's the poorest consumers who suffer most, since they spend a larger share of their income on basic products. A cheap smartphone or t shirt made in a highly efficient global supply chain has been a boon for people all over the world. Take that away or make it more expensive, and you cut into real living standards, especially in developing regions. International institutions are warning of these risks. The International Monetary Fund has estimated that a serious fragmentation of the global economy into rival blocs could shave several percent off of global GDP in the long run. That may sound small, but in a $100 trillion world economy, even a 2% loss is $2 trillion, and it typically translates into millions of lost jobs or lower incomes. More worrying, that scenario likely means higher poverty rates than we'd otherwise have, because when growth slows, it's the marginal populations, the ones just climbing out of poverty, who fall back. It's a bitter irony. Just as globalization helped lift a huge swath of humanity out of extreme poverty, nearly 1.5 billion people since the 1990s, a retreat from globalization could halt or reverse those gains for some. We are already seeing signs of stress in export dependent developing countries as global trade growth languishes. Protectionism and economic nationalism also undermine the cooperative spirit needed to tackle global problems. Issues like climate change or future pandemics require countries to work together and trust each other, including through trade, for instance, trading in clean energy technology. When each nation instead obsesses over self sufficiency, it can become a zero sum mindset. My gain is your loss, reminiscent of the mercantilist era. That's the mindset that prevailed during the original Iron Curtain divide, and it did no favors for the economies on either side of it. In the long run, innovation could suffer too. A lot of technological progress in recent decades happened through international collaboration, researchers from different countries working together, companies competing and also learning from each other globally. A fractured world might see duplicate research silos, slower diffusion of ideas, and less efficient use of talent. In practical day-to-day terms, if the new Iron Curtain continues to harden, people everywhere will notice changes. Perhaps gadgets costing a bit more, certain imported foods or products becoming scarce or pricier, jobs shifting around as industries relocate, and potentially a more volatile global economy. Investors and businesses already talk about two supply chain worlds, the Ninus, one centered on the US and friends, one on China and its orbit, which could force firms to duplicate operations or pick sides. For consumers and workers, that likely means fewer choices and opportunities. And for those at the bottom of the economic ladder, it means a harder climb up. In sum, the current geopolitical disruptions, from the US China decoupling and chip war to the reshoring and friendshoring scramble, are rewriting the rules of global trade. We are witnessing the emergence of trade barriers not seen in a generation, driven not by economics alone, but by strategic rivalry and fear of vulnerability. While these moves may fortify national security in the eyes of policymakers, they carry a high economic price. The great lesson of classical trade theory was that when goods cross borders freely, nations prosper together. The lesson of recent history is that how those gains are divided matters for social stability. Now we are learning a new lesson. If borders start to thicken again, undoing globalization, We risk not only economic efficiency, but also the shared progress that globalization enabled. The world's poor, who don't have cushions to absorb higher costs or lost export earnings, are the most vulnerable in this upheaval. As this podcast has explored, the big challenge ahead is finding a balance, protecting essential interests and reducing unequal outcomes without destroying the immense benefits that a connected global economy has brought. The hope is that we can avoid a full collapse into warring economic blocs and instead negotiate a new globalization that is more secure and more inclusive, rather than slamming the door and leaving the most vulnerable economies stranded outside. That's another thread pulled, but the fabric still tangled. If you found something worth thinking about, consider following the show and sharing it with someone who might too. You can listen to all episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Dheeraj Kumar, and I'll see you next time as we pull another thread from the fabric of our world.